My name is George Carter, and I'm 36 years old. I'm currently the only ranger still stationed in a remote section of Olympic National Park, a vast old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest where the climate is perpetually damp and fog hangs thick throughout the year. While most people call it quiet and desolate, I've always thought of this place as a, say, second home, filled with countless memories from my years on the job. I started working as a ranger when I was 25, going through all sorts of ups and downs, never imagining that one day I'd be forced to stare death in the face in this very familiar forest. When people think of my job, they probably picture me patrolling trails, taking notes, putting up signs, or occasionally driving away sneaky poachers. In reality, a ranger's life can be tense and even terrifying in its own way. I've encountered armed illegal loggers, been chased by wild animals in the dead of night, and witnessed countless strange occurrences deep in the woods. But none of that compares to what happened recently, a true nightmare that brought me face to face with unimaginable danger. That day, I received an order from my superiors to inspect a high ridge in the Mount Storm King area, one of the most treacherous parts of Olympic National Park, seldom visited by anyone. Normally, this assignment would be given to a team of 2 or 3, just in case something went wrong. However, due to a lack of manpower, I had to go alone. At first, I was somewhat uneasy, but with over 10 years of experience, I felt confident enough to handle whatever came my way. On the morning I set out, dark clouds rolled across the sky, and a cold wind whispered through the leaves, adding to the gloomy atmosphere. I drove my old pickup truck along a rough gravel path, leaving behind our tiny, isolated ranger station on the park's edge. If you ever saw that station, you'd understand why I say I work all alone. It's surrounded by miles of wilderness, with no other houses in sight, often blanketed by dense fog that obscures your view. After about 3 hours, I reached a narrow clearing where my truck could go no farther. I parked and prepared my gear: a backpack stocked with food, water, a small first aid kit, a radio, and a rubber bullet pistol for self-defense. Normally, I'd also carry a firearm with live rounds in case of dangerous wildlife, but a new regulation temporarily banned lethal weapons unless you had special permission. Honestly, I didn't expect to face anything more threatening than poachers or the usual wild animals. To get to the Mount Storm King area, I had to climb over a rocky slope and then follow a narrow, overgrown mountain trail. The deeper I went, the darker it got. At times, it felt like midday sunlight never reached this place. Now and then, strange birds cried overhead, warning me to stay alert. A damp, musty smell from moss and decaying leaves filled the air, and if I breathed too deeply, it made me dizzy. I moved quietly, taking notes on the surroundings and watching for any unusual signs. Fallen tree trunks lay tangled with thick moss growing over them, suggesting that no one had set foot there for ages. Occasionally, the static crackle of my radio reminded me I was still connected to the outside world, however faintly. The more I advanced, the clearer it became why so few people dared come here. The terrain was treacherous, and one slip could send you tumbling off a steep cliff into oblivion. Around midday, I paused at a relatively flat spot near a dry stream bed to eat some canned food. As I rested, I surveyed the area and noticed how thick the vegetation grew the further I went in. Game trails were overgrown and almost invisible. The canopy of leaves and constant cloud cover shut out most of the sunlight, casting an eerie dimness. Only then did I realize something strange. In a typical old-growth forest, you'd still hear insects or birds from time to time. Here, though, aside from the wind, it was almost silent. That absolute stillness raised the hairs on my arms. After a quick lunch, I continued on. My main goal was to locate the northern boundary marker of the park, a place rumored to have seen activity from illegal loggers. I walked steadily, keeping an eye out for evidence of tree cutting or any suspicious signs. Time slipped away as the afternoon crept toward dusk. Fog drifted in, thickening the shadows. I pulled out my radio to check in, but the signal was spotty and the voice on the other end garbled. Still, I managed to report that I was safe and planned to return early the next day. But my plans fell apart the moment I reached the edge of a cliff. Far below, I could just make out jagged rock formations through the swirling mist. I was peering down, trying to gauge the terrain, when I heard a deep growl behind me, close enough to feel the heat of its breath on my neck. My heart seized. Before I could turn, a foul stench hit me, and I knew a large predator was right behind me. I grabbed for my rubber bullet pistol, but I wasn't fast enough. A powerful force slammed into me from behind, knocking me forward. I screamed as I lost my balance. For a split second, I twisted in midair and glimpsed a tiger, its striped coat streaked with dirt, its yellow eyes glaring, fangs bared. It roared, the sound echoing around me. The attack was so sudden that I had no chance to fight back. My body spun off the cliff edge, flailing in free fall. I crashed onto a rocky ledge several yards below. The impact was brutal. I heard a sickening snap come from my right leg. Blinding pains coursed through me, nearly robbing me of consciousness. But my ordeal wasn't over yet. My back slammed against another boulder, crushing my radio, the only means of contacting the outside world, under my weight. Shards of metal and plastic scattered, some tumbling into the gorge beneath me. Somewhere above, I faintly heard the tiger's roar, but the agony in my leg and back left me powerless. Nightfall arrived swiftly. I had no way to send for help, and no one was around to hear any cries I might manage to make. Over the howling wind and the pounding of my own heart, I felt a bitter cold creep into my bones, and every tiny movement sent fresh bolts of pain slicing through me. Eventually, all I could do was lie there, vision swimming, each breath growing more labored, haunted by the image of the massive tiger and its deadly yellow eyes. In that moment, I realized how swiftly a familiar forest could turn savage, and how fragile my life truly was. It was ironic that I, a ranger who had devoted so many years to protecting this forest, now found myself caught between life and death on its unforgiving slopes. The wind whistled through the trees, and distant animal calls echoed in the darkness as it closed in on me. I tried to speak, but no sound came out, only a silent plea for some miracle to save me. Terror flooded my mind, and I drifted into unconsciousness, uncertain whether I would ever open my eyes again. I jolted awake, my body feeling numb and my mind clouded, unsure if it was yesterday or today. Everything around me was shrouded in quiet darkness. I was still lying on that rocky ledge after my horrible fall, where time seemed to stand still in utter hopelessness. Every part of me ached, but the sharpest pain came from my right leg. Even though the chill of the night seeped into my bones, what really weighed on my heart was the realization that I was trapped here, with no way to contact the ranger station or anyone else. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. In the darkness, I held my breath and listened, terrified that the tiger might still be nearby. But all I heard was the wind and the occasional rustling of leaves. There were no further signs of that creature. Perhaps it had left. That didn't mean this place was suddenly safe. I was exhausted. My food and water were gone or ruined after the fall, and my injured right leg was getting worse by the hour, making it impossible to stand or even move without excruciating pain. The first night crawled by, cold and relentless. By the pale light of dawn, I realized I was still alive. I searched through my backpack for anything that might help me hang on. Thankfully, I still had a thin blanket. Nearly everything else, water, rations, first aid supplies, had scattered among the rocks or fallen into the gorge. My radio, which could have saved me, was destroyed. My only real choice now was to rely on my own endurance and a shred of faith. On the first day, I tried eating a few dew-covered leaves from plants I knew to be non-toxic, but they did nothing to ease my gnawing hunger or thirst. From time to time, I'd tilt my head skyward, hoping for rain so I could gather even a trickle of water. But luck wasn't on my side. My throat was so parched it felt like knives when I breathed too deeply. By the second day, fatigue was overwhelming, and my body seemed ready to give up on me. Whenever I tried to doze off, the stabbing pain in my right leg jolted me awake. In that foggy half-sleep, I dreaded that if I ever really drifted off, I might never wake up. Caught in that haze, I kept picturing the tiger and hearing its monstrous roar in my nightmares. I started thinking about possible ways to get rescued. Though I knew the terrain well, the encircling cliff faces here were too steep, and my injuries made climbing impossible. The radio was in pieces, so calling for help was out of the question. If I just lay there waiting, my odds of surviving would shrink with each passing hour. Hunger, thirst, and pure exhaustion would soon claim me, and I feared I'd lose my sanity before that. Then, in a moment of clarity, I glanced at the slope above and saw something that looked like a plastic water line running through the foliage. an old makeshift pipeline that local residents used for their water supply. I knew the settlement was only a few hours' walk from that spot. If the line were to break, it wouldn't be long before folks from the community came to fix it. That was my lone hope. But the pipeline was still some distance away, and my injured leg wouldn't hold me. Still, the will to live flared inside me, and I realized I had to try. Gritting my teeth, I forced my body to roll over, crawling and dragging myself sideways. Each tiny movement sent cold shock waves of pain ripping through me, drenching me in sweat despite the chill in the air. Jagged rocks tore at my hands and knees, but I had no other choice. My own labored breathing and the scraping of stone seemed unbearably loud in that silent wilderness. It took me hours, but finally, I managed to reach the plastic pipe. Relief and agony collided in my mind. I had made it. My heart was pounding with a wild mix of pain and triumph. I took out the small folding knife in my pocket, one of the few items I still had, and carefully cut into the pipe, trying not to let the water pour out too quickly. A thin flow began trickling down onto the ground. I cupped my hands to drink, gulping that cool water into my parched throat. It was pure bliss. My thirst subsided, and my mind cleared a bit. I knew this would cause the flow of water to the nearby community to slow or stop, which would likely bring people out to investigate. They'd follow the line to find where it was leaking. I could only hope they'd see me at the base of the cliff. In such a desperate situation, any way to signal to the outside world was worth it, even if it inconvenienced those folks. I trusted that once they discovered someone had deliberately cut the line, they'd realize I was in urgent need of help. By the third day, the water from the pipe saved me from dying of thirst, but hunger became a brutal torment. To make matters worse, the injury in my leg grew hot and swollen. Still, the water let me keep some measure of strength and lucidity. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself over and over that someone would come soon. Every odd sound I heard at the top of the slope made me hold my breath, but it was always just the wind against the rocks. Night came again on the third day. I dragged myself to a slightly more sheltered spot, leaning against a rock to avoid the bone-chilling gusts. Curled up there, I fought to stay alive, repeating in my head, just a bit longer, they'll come. If it weren't for that shred of hope, I might have given up back on day one. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, I heard something that sounded like human voices. My heart hammered in my chest. Gathering the last of my strength, I let out a raspy cry. "I'm down here! Please, help me!" The sound that escaped was so faint and hoarse, I was afraid they might miss it. Panicking, I grabbed a small rock and started tapping it against a larger one, producing a steady clacking noise. Sure enough, the voices became clearer, and then a man's shout rang out. "Is someone down there?" I tried to answer, but I couldn't muster much volume. Thankfully, they must have caught some hint of my voice over the repeated tapping. Before long, I realized a group of people were making their way down the slope. They were local residents who'd come to check the pipeline because of the water issue. My eyes stung with tears when I saw a few figures crouching and peering down at me. They started calling out to one another and seemed to be making a plan. "The ranger fell off the cliff. Get more help." They quickly secured ropes and built a makeshift rescue rig, combining their efforts to descend to me. When they reached me and saw the state I was in, my severe injuries and obvious exhaustion, they couldn't hide their concern. A few of them offered me water and did what they could to bandage my wounds, while the rest began the difficult task of hauling me out of the rocky crevice. Though each jolt and shift was agony, I was beyond relieved knowing I was finally on my way to safety. Eventually, they carried me to a spot where a vehicle could reach us. After a few more hours trekking over rugged ground, I was taken out of Olympic National Park to a waiting ambulance that would bring me to the nearest hospital. Lying there on the stretcher, I felt the gravity of that horrible ordeal lift from me at last. My mind still reeled with nightmares of the tiger, the fear of that steep drop, the cold, and the hunger of those 3 days. Yet woven in with all those haunting memories was the image of the compassionate local residents, willing to hike dangerous trails to rescue a stranger, simply because they noticed a leaking water line. I was admitted to the hospital and spent a long time recovering. The doctors said my leg injury would take time to heal, and I'd need physical therapy later. I couldn't help but smile at that. At least there was still a chance I could stand on my own 2 feet again. During my stay, I often thought of that remote region of Olympic National Park and the terrifying moment the tiger attacked. I felt a lingering heaviness over everything I'd been through, but I was also quietly thankful for the lifeline I found by cutting that pipe, and for the kindness of those who came to my aid. Now, I no longer see the forest as merely a desolate place. I've come to realize that this wilderness is filled with lessons about resilience and the sheer preciousness of being alive. Despite the lingering trauma, I feel a renewed sense of duty as a ranger, to protect the forest while being more cautious with every step I take. In the end, it's our courage and perseverance that keep us in this world, even when fate seems determined to snatch us away. I began my story when my life was nearly hollow in the aftermath of my divorce. It felt as though everything had vanished: my house, my job, my pets, and even the friends I once believed were close. I moved into a shabby apartment in an unfamiliar city, sending out job applications to places ranging from cafes to restaurants. Yet, even though I'd left my old home in hopes of starting anew, I still felt a deep sense of dullness and melancholy. Amid that batch of applications was a peculiar one, a forest fire lookout position requiring no experience, which offered the chance to stay in a tower possibly 20 or 30 meters high in a secluded forest far from civilization. The job listing indicated that the tower was currently occupied, but additional candidates were needed in case a vacancy arose. Unexpectedly, that was the application that succeeded. I received a call from Mark, his voice terse, who told me about the pay and explained that I would need to live in the tower for the next 2 months. He added that I had to start immediately by driving to a specific spot and then hiking a considerable distance. Seeing no reason to refuse, I embraced the opportunity as a fresh beginning. Early the following morning, I drove as far as I could, then strapped on my backpack and began walking deeper into the forest. Even though it was summertime, the air felt crisp and invigorating, lifting my spirits in spite of my fatigue. The forest was renowned for its beauty and tranquility, so with every step I took, I grew more eager, planning to reach the tower before midday. By the time my watch read a little past 1, I found myself at the base of the tower, taken aback by how tall it truly was. A spiral staircase and 4 sturdy pillars supported a small cabin at the top, flanked by 2 storage sheds that I assumed housed supplies. I climbed, and upon entering the cabin, I discovered a single bed, a wooden table, a large wall map, a big radio, a smaller handheld radio, a few books, a flashlight, binoculars, and a hanging lantern, old but enough for a forest lookout. The wraparound windows provided a panoramic view of the endless treetops below, both stunning and intimidating. Mark had mentioned that I should contact the nearest tower for more details, so I turned on the radio and called. "Hello, is anyone there?" A bright female voice responded, introducing herself as Allison. Allison said she had been watching my part of the forest while awaiting my arrival, but hadn't observed anything out of the ordinary. She clarified the basics: stay alert for potential fires, forbid overnight camping, and ensure the trails remained clear. The restroom was located beneath the tower. Canned provisions would be replenished every week by Mark or his son. She advised me to check the notebook on the table for further specifics. Then she signed off, leaving me to inspect the cabin. Everything seemed typical of a forest lookout's duties, until I opened the notebook, flipped a few pages, and saw a grid-lined sheet slip out. On it, in erratic blue handwriting, were strange rules about what to do if I saw a woman with a deranged smile in the forest, or if I heard a woman crying between 1 and 4 in the morning, or if the lantern at night started flickering, or if I detected footsteps barreling up the stairs. There were 9 rules in total, along with a caution that if I came back to the tower and found someone else already inside, I had to run to the next tower at once. Initially, I wrote it off as a bizarre joke. Feeling uneasy, I didn't summon the nerve to radio Allison about it, worried she'd consider me nothing but a coward. After a quick lunch, I wandered around the forest briefly, testing the machete meant for clearing trails. Evening arrived, and just as I was nodding off, Allison radioed with a casual goodnight, causing me to jerk awake. I answered in a stiff tone. Lying down once more, I abruptly detected a scratching noise somewhere, like a wild animal clawing at the cabin's walls or door. I switched off the light, and the scratching grew more frantic, as if triggered by darkness. Then the big radio and the handheld both emitted piercing feedback. Startled, I hastily turned them off. Recalling Rule 7, which instructed shutting down every communication device and hiding under the covers if scratching was heard, I did exactly that, pulling the blanket over my head, holding my breath. The scratching repeated, sometimes far off, sometimes close, then at last faded away. By daybreak, I had barely fallen asleep, still reassuring myself it must have been nothing more than forest wildlife or the wind. The next day, though I kept the rules in my pocket, I tried to treat them as a mere joke. Late that afternoon, during a patrol, I encountered a yellow and red tent pitched in a small clearing, next to a fire that had burned out. I called out loudly, "Hello, camping isn't allowed here," but got no answer. On closer inspection, the tent contained no gear or sleeping bag. The unsettling silence put me on edge. I remembered that one rule mentioned if I heard a woman scream near a campfire, I should hurry back, but there was no screaming. I radioed Allison, who told me not to worry, she would handle it. Half an hour later, she radioed it again and said she had located the camper, a man who claimed ignorance and was now leaving. That night went by more smoothly, without any scratching sounds. In the morning, after a quick canned food breakfast, I set out to patrol again. By chance, I stumbled upon an odd trail that didn't appear on the map, slicing through dense foliage. Venturing in, I noticed red handkerchiefs tied at intervals to branches, as if they were guiding me. I kept following them until I reached the last one, attached to a heavy wooden hatch embedded in the ground. Opening it, I discovered a bunker about 4 meters deep, with a ladder. Inside, it was surprisingly neat, containing a broken camera, the battery was dead, and a sleeping bag. Plainly, someone had put great effort into constructing this concealed shelter. I decided to carry the camera back to the tower and attempt to charge it. On my way back, I noticed that same yellow-red tent again, but now a bright fire was raging. Irritated by the repeated violation, I went over and pulled back the flap. There was still nobody. While pouring water on the fire, I heard a sharp scream extremely close by. A terrifying figure, long-haired, seemingly female, arms limp, darted from the tree line, shrieking. Fear gripped me. I dropped everything and bolted to the tower. Her wails followed me until I finally raced up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. The screaming broke off abruptly, replaced by a dreadful hush. That night, I attempted to contact Allison, but all I got was a rough moan from some unknown woman, then that same ear-splitting shriek. I swiftly switched off the radio. Next morning, she was cheerful again, asking if I'd slept well. Still shaken, I explained all about the rules, the scratching, and that unhinged figure. She sighed, then revealed that a former lookout named Harvey had gone through the same ordeal. Harvey worked over a year, skilled and hardworking, until he suddenly disappeared. Mark supposed he'd left voluntarily, but Allison believed he'd fallen victim to the cackling woman he often spoke of in his final months. I felt a chill. Evidently, that monstrous woman was the same being who had chased me the previous night. At noon, I charged the camera taken from the bunker. The initial images were plain forest shots, roads, a car, or occasionally a family of 3. A tall father, a blonde mother, a little boy. Afterward, the pictures depicted only the father snapping selfies around the tower, restroom, trails, suggesting this was Harvey. The last images documented the bunker's construction, from the earliest phase to full completion, presumably intended to protect him from the evil woman. A handful of photographs showed a distorted figure behind a tree at night, seemingly an attempt to capture this hag on film. That evening, I was on the verge of sleep when I heard a woman sobbing. Rule 3 stated to disregard any woman's crying after 1 in the morning, yet the sorrowful sound was so intense that I chose to investigate. Following it, I came upon a gaunt woman dressed in long black, her arms apparently broken, skin chalky white. My radio crackled with static, and she halted her crying, staring at me with sunken eyes and a warped grin. Panicking, I dashed back to the tower. Spotting scratch marks across the floor, I realized she had entered ahead of me. Unsure what to do, since Rules 6 and 9 clashed, I listened to her scraping the edge of my blanket. Ultimately, I ran through the door and down the stairs with her right behind me. I reached the bunker and hid. She didn't appear to realize the subterranean space existed. I spent the night there cursing my own curiosity. In the morning, on my way back to the tower, I nearly toppled over at the sound of a young girl's voice. She introduced herself as Sam, supposedly Mark's daughter, claiming she had come to deliver supplies. I felt unsettled, but I managed a polite greeting. Later, I asked Allison whether Mark had a daughter. She replied that she only knew about his son. This left me even more uneasy, though I kept silent. That night, the scratching returned. I followed Rule 7. Then came the noise of footsteps rushing up the stairs. Per Rule 5, I switched on the main light and the sounds vanished. For 2 more hours, I stayed awake, studying my map for the path to Allison's tower. I meant to visit her personally. At dawn, I packed rations, my machete, and the camera, thinking the hike would take 3 or 4 hours. In practice, because her trails were abandoned and overgrown, it cost me 5. Arriving at the tower, I noticed it was dusty, webs everywhere, looking as though nobody had been there for ages. I nudged the door, which opened. Inside were old newspaper clippings about 2 sisters lost in the forest. One eventually found alive, the other never recovered. Another file, titled Oscar, contained personal data about me, including the cause of my divorce, even though Allison and I had never met face to face. Under the bed, I found a large backpack stuffed with men's clothing and a pocket knife engraved with "To my Harvey." Horrified, I tried to slip away, but Allison's voice rose behind me. She looked drained, eyes reddened, explaining how she and her sister had once gotten lost and, in desperation, she had pushed her sister to her death. She was rescued the following day, yet the guilt tore at her. Now, she said, her sister was still hungry, wanting vengeance on anyone in her path. Allison lunged at me in a frenzy. I dodged, unintentionally knocking her from the balcony's edge. I didn't check whether she survived. I dashed back to my tower, intending to leave the forest that evening, but the route to my car was too distant, and I was worn down. While hurriedly collecting my things, I glimpsed the hag's pallid face at the window, fixed in a hideous grin. Acknowledging I couldn't outrun her before nightfall, I steeled myself for one final night. Around midnight, the lantern flickered, Rule 4, so I turned on the main light. In those brief pulses of illumination, I saw her outside the glass door. I climbed into my bed, lay beneath the blanket, and held my breath, hearing her come inside. An icy breath hovered above me, and I quivered, knowing I could only endure a minute or 2 before gasping. The moment I did, she was gone. Peeking out, I found the room empty, the lights still shining. At daybreak, I stepped onto the balcony and spotted 6 campfires encircling the tower, each with a silent figure. One at a time, they fell into the flames, shrieking in torment. A tall, skinny man, a woman, even a mute child, then a muscular man, and finally a figure resembling Allison. Their screams merged in the smoky gloom. The 6th fire, however, stood vacant, apparently intended for me. As daylight broadened, Sam returned below, calling for me to descend, insisting she understood the entire story about Allison, Harvey, Rick, and that we needed to locate Allison's sister's remains for burning, or the hag would chase me eternally. Unsure yet unwilling to ignore any possible solution, I grabbed a fuel can, matches, and my machete. Sam stressed I had to be the one lighting the flames, because the hag's fixation was on me. We trekked into a cave. Sam pointed out that Allison's sister had died farther in. At some stage, Sam vanished, leaving behind only her dropped flashlight. I found a backpack with fuel and a knife labeled Harvey from me. On the wall, someone had carved the words, "The 10th rule is a lie." Sam reappeared just then, arms contorted, an awful grin on her face. She was the hag in disguise, moving freely in daylight. 5 additional forms crawled forth. Harvey, along with his wife and child, plus Rick and Allison, all twisted and grinning, holding me in place, while Sam bit deep into my chest. Together we became part of her throng, devoid of escape. In my last note, I explained that a new lookout had arrived at the tower, bringing his family, believing it the perfect occupation. We only come out of the darkness if she commands it. I warned everyone not to search for me because I belong to her and she will never allow me to leave. That was how it all concluded once I recognized the dreadful truth of the cackling monster. 9 rules let me survive for a time, but the 10th was a snare, offering no salvation. Harvey had lasted months thanks to his hidden bunker. In the end, it did him no good. Allison, concealing her sin, was likewise overtaken by the being she once called her forever hungry sister. Rick and the others met the same destiny. Even now, while I write these words, my body bears her mark, my spirit drained. If anyone stumbles across this tale, never apply for the lookout post in that dismal forest, because once the cackling hag chooses you, there is no turning back. Jack was a forest ranger who had devoted more than 20 years to his profession. He didn't just know every towering trunk and every narrow footpath in the expansive national forest, he also understood the migration habits of the region's wildlife. Quiet and reserved, he poured his heart into safeguarding the woods. On more than one occasion, he chased away illegal loggers, set up camera traps to deter poachers, and risked his own safety to rescue lost hikers. Some said that if anyone deserved the title Man of the Forest, it was Jack. Yet one fateful night, patrol would see him vanish without a trace, fueling countless chilling rumors about what really befell him. That night, as usual, Jack was assigned to patrol several remote trails. The forest had just come out of the rainy season, so the vegetation thrived, and the trails were muddy and slippery. To prepare for emergencies, Jack carried a radio set tuned to the ranger station's frequency, a powerful flashlight, a machete, and a detailed topographic map. He told his wife and kids at home not to worry, promising he'd return early the next morning. Nobody imagined it might be the last time they ever saw him. The path Jack was set to patrol that night wove deep into mountainous terrain, perpetually wrapped in mist. Few ventured there. He walked at a steady pace, occasionally pausing to inspect the trees or listen for unusual sounds. Far off, a troop of gibbons hooted, their calls echoing through the night, accompanied by the crunch of dry leaves under his boots. Everything seemed normal until a strange sense of unease began to gnaw at him. Was it the chill of the midnight air, or the sensation that someone or something was watching him? Glancing around, he shone his flashlight into the undergrowth on either side of the trail. Each pause revealed nothing more than gnarled tree roots, drifting fog, and the faint trickle of water. Around midnight, Jack came upon an old observation shack in the forest. Built long ago, it had fallen into disrepair, leaving only a sagging wooden frame and a rusted tin roof peppered with holes. Yet it provided suitable shelter in case of sudden rain. Planning to take a short break, Jack slung off his pack, took a sip of water, and scanned the darkness. Something rustled close by, so close that his heart pounded hard against his chest. He aimed his flashlight into the thickets, but found nothing aside from ancient trunks and swirling mist. The unsettling feeling of being watched refused to fade. Jack decided to report his status to the ranger station. His voice crackled over the radio, calm yet tinged with tension. "This is Jack. I'm at the old lookout post near the northern boundary. Everything seems all right. I may head back sooner than planned." A fellow ranger acknowledged his call, advising Jack to stay safe and keep in touch. Before Jack could switch off, the signal was interrupted by a strange static, like a brief, distorted transmission from someone else on the frequency. The eerie noise dragged on for a few seconds before cutting out. Frowning, Jack told himself it must be the poor reception in the depths of the forest. After a short rest, he left the shack. The night sky was starless, moonlight barely visible through the thick canopy, casting pale beams on the trail. Jack faced south to start heading back. Yet the muddy forest floor made progress difficult. Occasionally, the wind gusted swirls of mist across his path, obscuring his view. Suddenly, the snap of a branch broke the silence behind him. Spinning around, he swept his flashlight through the fog. Not a soul was there. Jack drew in a sharp breath, reminding himself to remain calm, though his feet moved faster, as though trying to outrun an invisible chill creeping up his spine. Back at the ranger station, around 2 in the morning, his colleagues lost all contact with Jack. Repeated attempts to hail him yielded only static, followed by dead silence. Their station chief assumed Jack might have run out of battery or encountered some small mishap. Yet the night was dark, and the forest hazardous, so they waited until dawn to form a search party. Everyone believed Jack was fine. He was, after all, the most experienced ranger in the team. At daybreak, the search party arrived at the old shack. They found only a mud-splattered flashlight lying near the rotting wooden steps. Footprints indicated Jack had lingered there, then continued deeper into the trail. Walking some 30 yards further, the searchers discovered a long, muddy skid mark, suggesting Jack had slipped, or perhaps been dragged. Broken branches strewn about hinted at a struggle or a panicked flight. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the thick mist. Only an oppressive hush answered them. On the second day, the search expanded into neighboring sections of the forest. Teams fanned out, shouting Jack's name in every direction, hoping he'd call back. Yet the only clue they found was a torn piece of ranger uniform snagged on a low-lying branch roughly 100 meters from the shack. There were no signs of large predators, nor was there any evidence of other human presence. Some guessed Jack might have fallen into a ravine or swift creek, but checks near the waterways turned up nothing. As the hours stretched on, theories multiplied. Some whispered of forest spirits, others guessed he'd pursued criminals and been ambushed. On the third day, as the final threads of hope began to snap, one search party member unexpectedly caught a faint radio signal. It fizzled in and out, distorted amid the wind. Tracking the signal brought them to a densely overgrown area rarely visited by rangers. In a tangle of vines, they discovered Jack's radio, its antenna broken, battery flung aside. More disturbingly, the device bore a series of deep scratches that resembled claw marks, though no one could confirm whether they came from an animal or a sharp object. The team stood in somber silence, trying to imagine how Jack might have fought for his life in the darkness. Had he managed any last call for help? Weeks passed, and the rescue efforts yielded no further clues. Each evening, the mist thickened, and calls for Jack reverberated through the trees without reply. Many of the volunteers returned looking haunted, insisting they felt a persistent stare from behind the mossy trunks. Some younger rangers, rattled by the mystery, suspected something supernatural. One swore he glimpsed a figure standing on a ridge, peering down at the search party before disappearing behind a bend. Jack's disappearance soon evolved into a local legend. The nearby villagers began whispering about strange occurrences. Eerie calls in the dead of night, a low, raspy male voice echoing "Help me" before the wind smothered it. Some claimed they recognized that voice as Jack's. More pragmatic residents insisted it must be the wind, the cry of a nocturnal bird, or simple hallucinations brought on by tension and fear. Nonetheless, a collective dread continued to grow. After nearly a month, the search party had to suspend operations. The rangers and Jack's family, exhausted and at a loss, could find no new places to explore. In everyone's hearts, a flicker of hope still burned. Maybe Jack would stride out of the shadows one day, unscathed, and tell a miraculous tale of survival. But as time wore on, the only tangible remains were his broken flashlight, his radio clawed to pieces, and the enduring chill that settled over nighttime patrols in the forest. No one truly knew what had happened to Jack. Yet, ever since his inexplicable disappearance, rangers assigned to nighttime patrol in that forest share an unnerving sense of foreboding. They constantly check over their shoulders, double-check their radios, and vow to exit the woods before the witching hour. Whispers still circulate about a spectral call echoing in the depth of night, a faint cry that pleads for help before trailing off into the rustling leaves. To this day, whenever the fog sprawls across the trails and the wind whistles through the canopy, people remember Jack and his final patrol that led to a mystery unsolved. And the midnight woods, though beguiling in their wild majesty, continue to guard a shadowy secret that may never be revealed. I've been a forest ranger for almost 10 years. My life revolves around these mountains, and sometimes I feel as though I'm part of this place, breathing the same air attuned to every echo in the night. I grew up in the highlands, and from a young age, I was enamored with the red dirt roads, the dense foliage, and even the unpredictable wildlife. Still, I never imagined I would come face to face with dangerous criminals in the depths of the forest on a fateful night that changed everything. That evening, the sky was moonless, and thick clouds obscured any source of light. I was assigned to patrol one of the most remote areas, near a dried-up stream that locals referred to as Cold Creek. It was also a known hideout for illegal loggers and poachers. Recently, there had been reports of strange gunshots, along with suspicious signs of hunting and unauthorized logging. My mission was to investigate, gather evidence, and if necessary, call for backup. My backpack felt heavy. Aside from some medical supplies, a raincoat, and drinking water, I carried a long-range radio, night vision binoculars, a machete, and a tranquilizer gun. With my experience, I knew I couldn't afford to be careless in the forest. There are always risks: wild animals, treacherous terrain, and now the added threat of armed criminals. I set out as the clock struck 7 p.m. Leaving the ranger station, I followed an old trail through towering trees. A layer of fog began to rise from the ground, the moist air seeping into every breath. Occasionally, I caught the sound of insects buzzing and the whistling wind weaving through the leaves. The forest at night had rarely felt this still, or maybe I was just tense, anticipating the possibility of running into dangerous strangers. As I walked, I studied the ground for any clues. After a while, I noticed fresh tire tracks pressed into the mud. They led straight into the old-growth forest, where the terrain was steep and littered with boulders. Normally, even a motorcycle would struggle there, yet it appeared these criminals had managed to haul either a vehicle or timber cargo through. Quietly, I snapped a few photos with my phone and noted the coordinates to include in my report. A shiver ran through me. It seemed the forest was no longer at peace. Pressing through a thorny thicket, I froze at an unsettling sight. A large tree trunk had been felled and its core sawn out. Wood chips and sawdust lay everywhere, while the stump showed rough cuts from a chainsaw. Clearly, a group of loggers, equipped with machinery, was at work. I moved closer and laid my hand on the exposed wood. The sap still oozed. They hadn't cut it long ago. It must have been a sizable operation, not just one or two people. I took out my camera and snapped several photos for evidence. While I was bent over taking pictures, I suddenly heard the crack of a broken branch behind me. My heart pounded. Quickly, I ducked behind the fallen trunk, gripping the tranquilizer gun, my pulse drumming in my ears. The footsteps drew nearer, irregular, as if the intruders were scouting or moving cautiously. Through a gap in the wood, I spotted a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, accompanied by low, murmuring voices. 3 figures were inching toward the spot where I'd just been. In the darkness, I couldn't tell if they were armed, but from experience, I suspected these men were involved in illegal logging or poaching. Their clothes appeared dark and muddy. I caught fragments of their conversation, something along the lines of, "Stay sharp. I think there's someone around." Just then, one of their beams focused directly on my hiding spot. I held my breath, flattening myself, making sure no light from my gear gave me away. I'd heard plenty of stories from colleagues about rangers threatened or even attacked by violent criminals. I knew I had to be extremely cautious. I decided to move backward toward a nearby thicket of brush. But as I shifted, my heel snapped a dry twig with a sharp crack that nearly stopped my heart. Instantly, the trio spun around, flashlights zeroing in on me. One of them shouted, "Who's there? Come out!" I dropped to the right, hoping to stay out of sight. But they clearly knew someone was close. A gunshot rang out, tearing through the silence. The bullet slammed into the tree trunk beside me, sending splinters flying. These weren't just illegal loggers. They were armed and willing to fire in a national park. Survival instinct kicked in. Grabbing my radio, I called the station. "Emergency! I've encountered armed suspects near Cold Creek. Request immediate backup." My voice quivered, my heart roaring in my chest. On the other end, the signal was patchy, but I heard the duty officer respond, "Copy that. We're on our way. Stay safe." Realizing I was in grave danger, I darted between shrubs, trying to distance myself from them. The pitch-black woods were my only advantage. Behind me, I could hear their pounding footsteps and urgent shouts. "Chase him! He's still close by!" Even though I knew the terrain well, their flashlights and guns made the odds feel slim if I wasn't extremely careful. Suddenly, a bright light flickered ahead, accompanied by the clang of metal. Clearly, another group was on the move. For an instant, I wondered if it might be fellow rangers arriving to help. But the curt voices and the telltale sound of loading guns signaled otherwise. It seemed to be a second branch of the same criminal operation. It felt like I was trapped between 2 hostile forces. I risked running down a clay slope, crouching low on an old trail leading toward the creek. I could feel the damp, slippery ground under my boots, and sweat coursed down my temples. Eventually, I spotted a narrow gap in some rocks, just big enough to squeeze into, where I held my breath and waited. My heart hammered as memories of my family, my colleagues, and my life in the forest played through my mind. I did not want to die out here in the darkness. I could still hear the gang above me, sporadically firing into the air as if to intimidate. About 10 minutes later, I heard a faint but familiar sound, the screeching whistle rangers sometimes use for emergencies. Thank goodness, backup had arrived. Powerful beams cut through the canopy, illuminating the forest floor. Relief flooded me, nearly bringing me to tears. The criminals quickly responded, shooting at the new lights. The gunfire shattered the silence, accompanied by running footsteps and shouts echoing through the woods. Knowing I had a chance, I radioed again, relaying my coordinates. I'm south of the clay slope, about 300 meters from Cold Creek. Be careful, they're armed. Static crackled before a reply. Copy, we'll contain the area. Stay where you are. I felt my nerves settle slightly. I checked my tranquilizer gun. It was intact, but useless at long range, and certainly no match for live ammunition. Still, knowing my colleagues had arrived gave me renewed courage. I carefully skirted the dirt bank, inching toward the flashlights. Emerging onto the main trail, I saw teammates fanned out with high-powered lamps and enforcement gear at the ready. The glare stung my eyes, but I felt protected at last. Faced with the Rangers' armed presence, the criminals seemed to break formation. Some bolted off, while others hid behind massive trunks, returning fire sporadically. The standoff lasted over 10 minutes before they finally realized they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They retreated deeper into the darkness, leaving behind an old truck loaded with precious timber and various hunting rifles. Local police were called in to secure the site and collect evidence. By dawn, the forest still smelled of gunpowder, and bullet-scorched leaves lay scattered where the gunfight had raged. As the sun rose, the Rangers and police held an emergency briefing at the scene. Exhausted and covered in sweat and mud, I gave a full account of everything I'd witnessed. Throughout my career, I had chased poachers, rescued lost hikers, and even faced off against aggressive bears. But nothing compared to the terror and intensity of confronting armed criminals. It was an experience I'd never forget. A few days later, I was back on duty. My leg was still bruised, and there were scratches on my arms, but my resolve remained unbroken. I knew exactly why I served as a ranger, to protect these forests and guard the wild creatures that call them home. There are plenty of bad actors out there ready to plunder nature's resources, and they'll shoot anyone who stands in their way. But we Rangers stand together, united in trust and purpose, ready to face danger. Even now, I still shudder when I recall that gunfire in the night, the sound of boots close behind me and the raw fear that coursed through my veins. Yet it was on that very night that I truly understood the worth of camaraderie, of courage, and of duty. The forest will endure, and as long as we remain on guard, no one will freely destroy this magnificent gift of nature. My name is Jake, and I'm 29 years old. I've worked as a forest ranger in a national park located in the Central Highlands for nearly 4 years. My daily duties mainly involve patrolling, guarding, and especially watching for any signs of forest fires during the dry season. Outsiders often assume a ranger's life is dull, but for me, it's been a journey fueled by passion and responsibility. Yet no one could have predicted that an experience from just over a year ago would show me what true fear feels like in the depths of the forest, especially since I thought I knew every corner of this place. That particular dry season began earlier than usual. The park management assigned me to spend the night at an observation tower in a secluded part of the old-growth forest. The tower itself wasn't very tall, only 4 wooden levels topped by a rusty tin roof, but because it sat on a gentle hill surrounded by ancient trees, it offered a decent view of the area. My main task was to stand watch. If I spotted even the smallest sign of smoke or fire, I had to report it immediately. A few of my colleagues had taken turns on day shifts or brief evening shifts here before, but almost no one stayed overnight. The reasons were obvious. The tower was in utter isolation. There was no proper electricity, phone signals were unreliable, and it took nearly 3 hours of hiking from the main station to get there. On my first night, I arrived around 5 p.m. The sun was just beginning to set, and the late afternoon light streaming through the foliage was a warm, honey gold color. I came well prepared: a flashlight, a handheld radio, drinking water, light snacks, and a sleeping bag. The tower stood on wooden pillars, with a loosely fenced area below to deter larger wildlife. As I climbed the creaking steps, I felt as though I were entering a completely different realm. Inside, there was only a wooden table, one chair, and a small window that opened to a panoramic view. Everything had a worn, old-fashioned look, evoking nostalgia and a slight chill. Around 7 p.m., I did one last flashlight sweep of the perimeter before settling in for my night shift. The forest at dusk was silent, interrupted only by the occasional insect call or the lonely cry of a nocturnal bird. I returned to the top level of the tower, opened my logbook, noted the weather conditions, and scanned the 4 directions. All I could see was pitch-black darkness, with shadows of tree canopies under a faint sliver of moonlight. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my duty, while pushing aside the eerie tales my ranger colleagues sometimes shared, tales of unsettling calls echoing through the night, fleeting human-like figures, or legends of forest spirits lurking among the trees. I continued like this until about 10 p.m. Drowsiness started to creep in, but I had to fight it. My job was to remain vigilant. Right then, I heard what sounded like very light footsteps below the tower, like someone treading carefully on fallen leaves. At first, I told myself it might just be a civet or a weasel, some small forest creature. However, these steps sounded steady, not like a 4-legged animal. My heart began to pound. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully descended to the 2nd level. Peering out the small window that faced the tower's base, I switched on the beam. It was pitch dark outside, and my flashlight beam revealed nothing definitive. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was moving through the scattered trees. I continued like this until about 10 p.m. Drowsiness started to creep in, but I had to fight it. My job was to remain vigilant. Right then, I heard what sounded like very light footsteps below the tower, like someone treading carefully on fallen leaves. At first, I told myself it might just be a civet or a weasel, some small forest creature. However, these steps sounded steady, not like a 4-legged animal. My heart began to pound. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully descended to the 2nd level. Peering out the small window that faced the tower's base, I switched on the beam. It was pitch dark outside, and my flashlight beam revealed nothing definitive. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was moving through the scattered trees. I quickly closed the window, went back inside, and attempted to use my radio to call the station on our internal frequency. All I got was static. Between bursts of crackling, I only managed to say something like, "This is Jake at the observation tower on the hill, hearing strange noises. Can anyone read me?" before losing the signal entirely. Anxiety settled over me. I silently hoped it was just some harmless animal foraging nearby, not a person or something more ominous. About an hour later, I decided to go down to the 1st level, armed with my flashlight and a small knife. This time, I heard twigs snapping in the backyard area behind the tower. Proceeding carefully to the door, I aimed my flashlight all around. The wind had picked up, rustling leaves so loudly it was hard to distinguish natural sounds from human ones. Still, I sensed I wasn't alone. Then my flashlight swept across the fence, and I spotted a hunched figure, small-framed, apparently scouting the area. For a brief moment, I was about to call out when the figure suddenly whipped around to look directly at me. The instant their eyes met my flashlight beam, a chill ran through me. They had a gaunt face with eyes wide open, reflecting the light in a haunting way. Without a word, they lunged into a nearby thicket. Panicking, I ran a few steps after them, shouting, "Who's there?" but got no response. A few branches cracked, leaves rustled, and then nothing. The night was silent again, save for my pounding heart and labored breaths. I hurried back into the tower, bolting the door behind me. I had never felt such raw fear. I tried to stay calm, fiddling with the radio again, but there was no signal at all. My first thought was to wait until morning and then head out immediately to report this to the other rangers. For now, I'd have to hold my ground, hoping the stranger wouldn't return. I crawled into my sleeping bag, pressing my back against the wall, with my flashlight nearby and the knife within reach. The night felt endless, and I was so on edge that I couldn't stop staring at the window. An hour or two later, I must have dozed off momentarily because I snapped awake to a rattling noise from the floor below, like someone was fiddling with the door handle. My heart felt like it might burst. Moving stealthily, I crept toward the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The rattling turned into scraping, then stopped. Silence again. I waited a few minutes, then dared to peek through a small gap in the wooden floor. Darkness everywhere. No sign of the figure, no further noise. I went back upstairs and sat down, hands clasped around my head, trying to ward off grim thoughts. All traces of tiredness vanished. By 4 a.m., I was on the second-level balcony, gazing toward the eastern sky. In the dim pre-dawn light, the forest looked still, as if holding its breath, aware that someone might be lurking nearby. Never had I longed for daylight as much as I did then. I reassured myself that once morning broke, I'd be able to see clearly, and I prayed the stranger had already left. Finally, around 5:30 a.m., the sky began to glow. Wasting no time, I packed up my belongings, did a cautious inspection around the tower, and found nothing conclusive. Just a few footprints in the muddy spots near the fence. The tracks weren't deep, possibly from worn-out shoes. They were definitely human. A shiver ran through me. I dreaded the thought of a thief or an intruder intentionally prowling around. From the observation tower, I made my way straight back to the ranger station. Every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge, afraid the stranger might be lying in wait. Once I arrived, I immediately reported everything to my station chief. I recounted the noises the moment I shone the flashlight on that eerie face, and how the figure vanished into the darkness. My colleagues listened, equally unsettled. Some thought it might have been a wanderer. Others suspected a poacher hiding out in the forest. Whoever it was, their intentions were unclear, and their stealthy actions left everyone uneasy. The station chief decided to send additional rangers to inspect the tower, install new surveillance equipment, and improve communication options. I was granted leave for the day, still shaken by the ordeal. Even now, after transferring to a different location, I sometimes startle awake at night, thinking about that incident at the observation tower. I've learned to be more cautious. Before, I believed the dangers of a nighttime forest came only from wild animals or tricky terrain. I forgot that humans can be just as unpredictable. The sound of stealthy footsteps, the glaring eyes in the darkness, and the creaking wooden door, these details form a haunting memory that's impossible to erase. Still, being a forest ranger remains my greatest passion. That frightening experience has helped me mature, taught me to be more prepared, and trained my ears to catch every little noise that might signal a threat. Above all, I've learned that no matter how remote or silent an old-growth forest may seem, it holds mysteries beyond our understanding, and sometimes those mysteries appear in the form of strangers lurking just out of sight. The hunt for the mysterious. In recent days, the old-growth forest along the Black Peak Range has been abuzz with rumors of a mysterious wild beast. Locals whisper about goats and cattle being brutally killed at night, with wounds so horrific that they bear little resemblance to the claw marks or bites of wolves, bears, or any known carnivores in the area. People have become increasingly uneasy, especially after reports emerged that several local youths were chased by a dark shadow that hovered between life and death. In response, the ranger team, led by Commander Mike, decided to launch an expedition to hunt down this enigmatic creature. Mike, a seasoned veteran with years of experience handling wild predators, had long been responsible for rescuing injured animals and patrolling the depths of the forest. Along with his two younger colleagues, Jake and Tina, he quickly assembled the necessary equipment: a tranquilizer gun, an infrared spotting scope, a night vision camera, and a high-powered radio set for constant communication. The local residents even volunteered supplies and alerted the rangers to the areas where attacks had repeatedly occurred. At dawn the following day, the team set out into the forest. Layers of thick mist drifted over the ground, and the ancient trees stretched high, obscuring most of the sunlight and intensifying the eerie atmosphere. They followed the unusual tracks, patches of fur and deep claw marks on the tree barks, interspersed with footprints that were larger than the typical wild canines, yet didn't match any known predator. These signs were puzzling and unnerving, suggesting the possibility of a creature unlike anything previously recorded. On the first day, they only heard the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves and occasionally glimpsed deer and wild squirrels, with no indication of the beast. However, as night fell, the ambience drastically shifted. When the moon emerged and the mist began to disperse, a low, resounding howl echoed from deep within the forest. Mike and his team froze, their eyes glued to the infrared scope. In the distance, they spotted a large, dark silhouette moving stealthily through an open clearing. They inched closer to observe it. Suddenly, the creature paused, turned its head, and stared directly toward them. Under the scope's glare, its eyes shone a fierce, burning orange, a look of both wariness and defiance. From deep within its throat, it emitted a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down the spines of all three rangers. Mike raised his tranquilizer gun and carefully took aim. Yet, in an instant, the creature bolted, vanishing into the darkness with only the echo of its howl lingering in the air. At daybreak, the rangers reluctantly returned to their base camp, carrying with them only a few indistinct photographs capturing hints of something truly strange. The images were blurry and indecipherable, yet it was clear that what they had encountered was no ordinary animal. Whether it was a mutated variant or a completely unrecorded species, their primary objective remained: either capture it or drive it far away from the nearby community to prevent further tragedy. In the weeks that followed, the pursuit continued. Every time a blood-curdling roar echoed from the murky depths of the forest, Mike, Jake, and Tina steeled themselves to continue the hunt. Despite bouts of fear and exhaustion, they pressed on, for they understood that protecting the local residents and preserving the delicate balance of the forest was their highest duty.